Buddhism is one of the major religions originating from ancient India, sharing many beliefs and practices with Hinduism, and containing many important and influential people. The one I will be focusing on in this video is largely regarded as one of the most beloved figures in Buddhism, Ananda. He is best known for being the first cousin of the Buddha and one of his principal disciples and most beloved disciple for many years. He is believed to have lived the same time as Buddha, around the 6th century BC India. Naturally, this means we don't have a lot of concrete evidence about his life, but there is a lot of information about him because of his closeness to the Buddha and his own contributions to Buddhism that we see present in today's practices. He was born in Kapilavatthu, India, and was the Buddha's cousin, being the son of Amitabha, who was the brother of the Buddha's father. Ananda entered the order of monks in the 2nd year of the Buddha's ministry, and in the 25th year was appointed his personal attendant. This job was basically just to run messages for him, prepare his seat, and to attend to any of his personal needs. For the first 20 years of the Buddha's ministry, he had several attendants, but one day he decided to replace his attendant, and the story goes that all of the monks enthusiastically offered their services except Ananda. Later, when asked why he had not volunteered, he replied that the Buddha knew best who to pick. When the Buddha chose Ananda to be his personal assistant, he said that he would accept the position, but only on several conditions. Some of the conditions were as follows. The Buddha should never give him any food that he received, nor any robes, and that he should not be given any especial accommodation. He would not have to accompany the Buddha when he accepted invitations to people's homes. Ananda insisted on these conditions because he did not want people to think that he was serving the Buddha out of desire or material gain. Because he was the Buddha's cousin, it was very important to him that he didn't receive any sort of special treatment, so that people wouldn't think that that's why he got the job. He went on to be known as his beloved disciple, not only beloved by the Buddha, but by the followers as well, and to this day is still known as his most beloved disciple. Another huge role of Ananda's in Buddhism, and another thing that he's very well known for by the practitioners of Buddhism, is being the preserver and keeper of the Dharma. This job is understood throughout Buddhism to be very important, and most of the texts in the early Buddhist Sutta Pitaka are attributed to Ananda's recollection of the Buddha's teaching during the first Buddhist council. So he was basically the relayer of Buddha's messages, because Buddha could not write or read, and most of his messages were distributed verbally through stories, and most of it was Ananda. Ananda's skills with memory and the fact that he was always by the Buddha's side made it easy for him to be responsible for preserving and transmitting the Buddha's teachings. Gradually, over time, a large body of oral teachings were developed due to Ananda, and this meant that people far from the Buddha's presence could hear his teachings without the aid of books or the necessity of having to travel long distances. This role that he had as preserver of the Dharma was, and still is, very important and regarded in Buddhism, because those were the foundations that created Buddhism and a lot of Hinduism as well. And without Ananda to relay and remember his teachings, the Buddha might not have been as impactful to the Indian people, because he wouldn't have been able to relay the messages as well, and who knows what we would have today. Something else that I think is interesting to know is that a lot of information we have about the Buddha and his teachings is through Ananda's eyes, and I think that because he was one of the more regular people that the Buddha surrounded himself with, it made other regular folk, everyday folk, feel seen and represented in him, and I think that's also why the people were so taken with him. Because of his vast knowledge of the Dharma, sometimes the Buddha, if he was feeling tired or having some sort of issue, would ask Ananda to speak in his place, and it was found that Ananda's teachings of the Buddha, obviously, were a lot more comprehensible to the everyday folk. Though Ananda was sort of known as the Buddha's right-hand man and best disciple, he actually did not achieve enlightenment until after the death of the Buddha, despite his attempts. I think this is really interesting because the fact that the Buddha allowed him to speak for him, basically, despite the fact that Ananda was not fully enlightened like him, really says a lot about Ananda's impact and his character. This whole thing sort of introduced the idea that is still important today, that you don't necessarily need to have achieved enlightenment in order to speak about the Dharma and of the Dharma and teach the Dharma. Another really big and slightly controversial, only because some of the details of this story don't line up, so it's known to be controversial within the community. It's said that Ananda was who convinced the Buddha to allow women to be brought into the order and ordained as nuns, and it is said that the Buddha's stepmother wanted to become a nun, but Buddha turned her down multiple times, and Ananda found out about this and intervened on her behalf and convinced the Buddha that it should be allowed. It's said that one of the questions that he asked the Buddha during this conversation was if women could achieve enlightenment and all of the things that men could achieve, and the Buddha said yes, and this was sort of how that happened. So that is a very huge and impactful conversation that Ananda had, and it shows how regarded he was and respected by the Buddha, that the Buddha was willing to hear him out on this when he wasn't willing to hear his own stepmother out on it. When the Buddha died, Ananda found that he had a lot more time to focus on achieving enlightenment because he was not, catering to him anymore and helping him out with stuff. So he began to attempt to achieve enlightenment once more. There's even a quote from the Buddha before his death that said that the purity of his heart was so great that should Ananda die without being fully liberated, he would be a king of the gods 7 times because of the purity of his heart. However, Ananda did eventually achieve enlightenment, and the story goes that he was so focused and kept trying to achieve enlightenment, practicing harder and harder, until he was convinced that he would never be able to attain enlightenment, and so he gave up and decided to lie down and sleep, and as his head touched the pillow, he became enlightened. I think that story also really serves as a really good message within Buddhism that a lot of people go back to or think about when they are trying to achieve enlightenment themselves. I think that all of these things solidify him as one of the most important figures in Buddhism.